Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If we could have everybody take their seats, please, we'll begin shortly. Have everybody outside the auditorium to please come in.
What's going on, people? What's going on?
Distinguished guests,
Sound?
a very good morning to you all, and thank you so much for making the time to be here.
How do we get
For
the
those
audio?
that
Why
have
do we have
traveled
it?
from so far away, welcome. And as we say in Kinyarwanda, Murakaza Neza, welcome to the land of 1,000 hills, our beautiful country. We hope you've taken the time to look around, to meet some people. And if you haven't, perhaps later on you'll be able to do that. I want to acknowledge our virtual audience. Thank you so much for following. I am Isabel Masozera, as said earlier, the founder of Masozera Africa, and it is a digital couch and a home for fearless conversations and apologetic conversations about holistic wellness for women who are African by African women. It is my honor to moderate the first session. What is going to happen in the next 1 hour is we're going to focus on the role of policy in closing the gender gap in Africa. I believe without a doubt that enacting legislation that provides equal opportunities for women and men and expanding legal protections in areas that matter for women and girls, and also removing exceptions in laws that disadvantage women and girls is fundamental to closing the gender gap. And this is why I am really happy that we're having this conversation. It is easy to focus on the things where we see quick results, like social welfare, not to downplay its importance. But when we are looking for sustainable change, we have to think about policy processes. And this is why philanthropy has to go there. Philanthropists have that power to be catalysts, to be influencers for the world that we want to see, an equal world, a world where girls and women live in dignity. I do have a power panel today, and they are going to join me to help examine the gaps and the shortcomings that are in existing efforts, but we are also going to be looking at emerging practices and innovations that help close the gender gap, with a view of promoting policy coherence and committed action in the service of gender equality. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could help me warmly welcome our exceptional panelists. Claire Akamanzi, the CEO, Rwanda Development Board. We can do better than that, right? Welcome. Second. Dorothy Nyambi, who is the CEO and President, MEDA. Welcome, Dorothy. It's not only women. We have a man on the panel. Swethan Munyatwari, who is the Vice Chairman and co-founder of the International Law Institute African Center for Legal Excellence. And last but definitely not least, Omonyana Rujeje, who is the Executive Director, Section 27. This is a good time for anybody who is not yet seated to please take your seats. We'll begin in just a moment. We hope you're comfortable. You've had your breakfast. You're acquainted with your neighbor. In Rwanda, we believe in being generous with that. Hello, how are you? Yes? We've done that. Can we take a second? Yeah? Okay.
They've set the wrong way.
All right.
They've set the wrong way.
I would like to request our panelists to
they've set the
please
wrong
make
way.
sure your microphone
swap.
is on only
they need
when
to
you're
swap.
speaking so that we don't have a lot of feedback. The ground rules will be very simple. You'll each have 3 minutes to give your opening remarks, and what I'd love from you is to help us give that intellectual frame in terms. We apologize. Small
They've set the
technical.
wrong-
Share some examples, some scenarios within your setting, but also what you have seen globally. I'd like to start with a lady. Rujeje, the floor is yours.
What is it? It's 50. It's 50.
Thank you so
It's
much.
60, sorry.
It's lovely to be home in Rwanda. I thank you. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. As a member of civil society, we often don't get invited into these spaces to share our perspectives, so thank you for that. I was also quite surprised to get a COVID test. I feel like a lot of us have moved past COVID and are moving around the world and through our lives as though COVID has come to an end. But I think Rwanda is right to take all these protocols seriously until now. And they're right on a lot of things, including on the gender gap. Rwanda leads in the number of women in parliament, for example. So it's quite apt that we're having this discussion here in Rwanda. But I think it's important to recognize that COVID is still here with us, and also that COVID has deepened inequality around the world. Very early on in the pandemic, we were getting estimates of the deepening inequality, something like 100 million people being pushed into extreme poverty as a result of COVID. And there's no doubt that women bear the disproportionate burden of that poverty. And in my view, then, women need to be at the forefront of decision making as we talk about rebuilding. There's all this discussion about rebuilding post-COVID, rebuilding our democracies, our economies, and our health systems. And we know that women lost most of the jobs that were lost during COVID. The majority of those women are also carers of children, of the elderly, and of families in general. And so you find that women are bearing additional burdens. We also saw that our health systems collapsed in many African countries under extreme strain, but also women were there at the front lines and are 70% of the global health workforce. And yet, the decision-making is in majority men. So we need to flip that on its head, and we need a policy environment and structures in our countries that recognize that women do bear the disproportionate burden of poverty, but also that they are at the front lines. And so I think discussions have to be around how do we respond to the nature of health systems, of the way in which women contribute to society, to our economies, and very much to our health systems. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Rujeje. Can we appreciate her? Thank you. We'll move on to you, Swethen, if you could take the floor. Yes.
Thank you, Isabel. And even though I'm a minority on this panel, I really I'm very familiar with this kind of environment because at home, again, I'm a minority. I'm really happy that we're having this discussion here in Rwanda, a global example of closing the gender gap, probably not only on this continent, but really globally. And also that this coincides with the launch of the Gender Fund, which is championed by our chair, Sisi Masiwa. So really proud that we're having this conversation at that time. I'm also proud that we're having this conversation in Africa and not in London, where we're talking to the West and with our begging bowls. And so the fact that we can mobilize African philanthropists, which is what APF has been doing really well and taking the lead on this continent on this issue. This is a complex topic because we're talking about mobilizing African philanthropists to inform policy. And I just want to preface my remarks by saying that in the West, in the US, there is legislation that allows philanthropy to benefit from tax deductions and other innovations in giving. Many African countries, actually I can't think of one that I know that actually provides the same kind of structure. So on the one hand, you have a situation where you're asking African philanthropy to influence policy without an enabling environment to do so. So that's something to think about. As I thought about this subject more critically, I actually realized that even though we don't have the legislative frameworks to influence policy, we actually can influence policy. And I'm talking more about small philanthropies, small foundations, high net worth individuals. If you look around our continent, I don't think many will disagree. I know certainly Queen Sylvia from Uganda will agree that our private philanthropists have a unique ability to influence government. Indeed, a lot of high net worth individuals on our continent influence government, but they influence government for their own reasons. Business, opportunities, getting tax breaks for various things. So as I thought about the issue, I realized that if we coalesced, if African philanthropists coalesced, they could do very powerful things. And what are some of the things they could do? Basically, lobbying creatively on high-impact issues with legislators, with the executive whom they regularly interact with, to influence legislation. But I must also say that also there is a need for structural reform to actually make it easier for not only philanthropists, but for the general public to be able to follow the legislation that is in the public good, basically more visible. So a more democratized impact. The other thing which is really crucial for African philanthropies, especially the small ones, the large foundations, it's easier because they have the structures to do it, is to get professional help. Because before you can talk about being a philanthropist, one of the things that you have to have are the right structures. engaging professional help, and then strategizing around issues. Yes. Is the issue having more women legislators? Rwanda is a great example of that. In the United States, in Massachusetts, a good example was some small philanthropies which came together to increase minority participation in high office. And that's how Deval Patrick became governor of the state of Massachusetts. So if we came together, there are quite a number of things that African philanthropists can do in concert. Networking in events like this is also very important because you get to share ideas with northern philanthropies and find ways to pool resources around very important issues.
Yes, and in the interest of time, I'd like to invite you to wind up in 30 seconds, but we'll definitely come back to you to expound later on the creatively lobbying and more of those creative ways we can do that. Yes. Okay, all right, we'll move on to Dorothy.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you to the African Philanthropy Forum for inviting me. I'm really excited to be back in Rwanda, like many of our panelists. I think, on this panel, I'll say I'm the only one who doesn't have a legal background. So I'm coming at this from a very strong civil society perspective and from a lived experience side of it. So I think for me, the work around policy is so important. It's so important that if we want to work as civil society at a systems level, doesn't matter what we do, education, health, economic empowerment, if we do not look at that enabling environment to make sure that it is part of the programs that we design, it is part of the partnerships that we bring into play, I believe that we're not going to be able to have what I define as real sustainable development. So for me, I think, the timing is right. As we come out through COVID, let us not go back and continue to do what we're doing pre-COVID. Let us really take the time, especially as civil society, to say, what do we need to do to make sure that we don't snap back? But most importantly, that we can now really do great sustainable work that includes that policy environment. With respect to how philanthropists, can contribute, I strongly believe that, philanthropists in Africa, in the global south, in the global north, you are the risk takers. You're the ones who are going to take the risk with us so we can build the evidence that will continue to inform policy and create policy. And then in addition to that, once things have been tested, it is so important that as we move forward, we take things to scale, Born in Africa, in Cameroon, I'm one of those who says, I'm exhausted about what I call pilotitis. Everything is a pilot. No more pilots. We need to take things to scale. And it is so important that we take things to scale at a systems level, and we cannot do it without policy. So my call, to everybody is, let us work together. Like Swinton said, I think there's a global philanthropy, there's philanthropy in the global north, which is incentivized by a tax system. But I would really want to see how do those philanthropists in the global north come alongside our philanthropists in the global south, and so let's work together. It's a global world, it's one world. So thank you, Isabel.
Global world, one world, thank you. We now give it to Claire. I know that Rwanda has done tremendously well. A lot of ground has been covered. So we're going to be looking to you in terms of hearing some of the successes, the lessons, and so much more. But from a sort of like a general perspective, if you could give us your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Isabel, and good morning, everyone. I must also say how pleased I am to be with you this morning. Thank you, Tsitsi, thank you, Mosun, and everybody else behind APF 2022. And of course, thank you very much for choosing Rwanda. We're happy to host you here in our country. But a lot of times when people read the statistics about gender parity in Rwanda, when they read that Rwanda has the highest number of women in parliament at 61%,
or when they read the World Economic Forum report that says Rwanda is the 6th country in the world that has made the most progress in closing gender parity, and the first in Rwanda, in Africa, the first question they ask me is, how did Rwanda do this? What exactly did Rwanda do, to be able to have 61% of women in parliament, or to be ranked the 6th in the world? One of them asked me once, but are there men in Rwanda? 61% in parliament, do you have men in Rwanda? Like, how do you do this when you have men in Rwanda? Yes, we do have men in Rwanda. And I think that the first policy in Rwanda is the policy of intention, if I can call it that. Being very clear that closing the gender parity is a big priority for the country. And being very clear at the very top with the president of the country, who has made it very clear that this is a priority, that Rwanda will invest everything it can to realize. I think that's the beginning point. Because once that deliberate intention is there, everything else, all the policies come into place. And so with that intention and that priority, the government of Rwanda, in its constitution, put in place a first policy that I think was the foundation of everything, which is 30% of public offices must be occupied by women, 30%. So that is a minimum. Now, apart from that, also all the laws that were discriminating against women, one particular one that really was glaring was inheritance rights for women, which were not there. The government started by removing all the laws that were discriminative to make sure that all women and girls have the same access to opportunities, to school, to education, to jobs, to running for office, just like their male counterparts. And I think that was really important. So putting in place those policies and regulations were very important. But back to the point of policy and intention, you can have all the policies and all the regulations, but what's really important is that you act on them. You implement them. One of my favorite stories, hearing our president talk about his experience in this journey, was that sometimes he would ask for appointments. I want to make appointments in cabinet, I want to make appointments in public institutions, get me at least 1/3 should be women, or a board of directors. And in the beginning, sometimes people would come to him and say, we've looked for women, we can't find them. So we only have a list of men. And he would say, oh, go back, when you find the women, you bring me the list. And very quickly, the women would be found. Somewhere, there were women. So I think that intention, and we can all do that. If you're a philanthropist, if I'm going to give you my money, what is your gender looking like? Can I make that one of the things that I look out for? If I'm going to give you money, if I'm going to invest in you, what is the gender parity that you're working towards? Show me that, and then once you do that, people will actually work very hard to achieve these goals. And I think leaders have that obligation, as we've seen in Rwanda. And leaders have a lot of influence in making this happen, whether you're a private company, whether you're a public institution, whether you're a philanthropist. If the leaders, man or woman, of that organization makes this a priority, it will become a priority, and we will implement the policies that we put in place. The second thing is the power of role models. When you put the policy, I want 30% this, I want, and I'm going to require that it's implemented. Once you have enough role models beget more role models, and we've seen that in Rwanda. One of the stories I've also had at the beginning, when this policy was put in place in Rwanda, I wasn't in government at the time, was that when 30% was the constitutional requirement, government and public and political parties worked very hard to find the 30%. Where are the women? It was not easy to find women to occupy the 30%. But because the 30% were found, other women saw these role models and saw that, oh, if someone saw that I went to school can become an MP, then I also can become an MP. You start to see that it's familiar because people that you know are occupying these positions, and these role models are very powerful in really inspiring the next generation of leaders. That's why from 30%, now we're 61% of women in parliament. And sometimes we say, let's slow down. We don't want to wake up and it's 80% women. Then we'll have another parity challenge to deal with. But role models are really important. And it's not just in the public offices, even the private sector. Because it's become not just role models, but policy, it's also become something that is more and more becoming cultural. It's normal now for a private company that is putting a board of directors to say, okay, do we have 30% women? It's normal now for banks, for example. We have 15 banks in Rwanda. 5% of the banks, including the biggest bank in Rwanda, is run by a woman. So even the banking sector is meeting the minimum threshold of 30%, and I think that role model is very, very important.
And on that note, I'm going to have to cut you off, but we'll definitely be coming back to you to just really understand more about how it's done, not just the examples, but some of the lessons that can be derived from that, and you did that brilliantly. Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists for your opening remarks, but also to inform our audience, we're not just here to listen, we are here to participate. So in case you had something that resonated with you and you want somebody to expound on that, write it down. We'll have a microphone move around a little later on during our Q&A section, and then you have an opportunity to ask. All right, now we'll get to our questions, and I would like to start with our human rights lawyer on the panel, Rojeje. In what ways does establishing equal rights in policies, but as well as laws and institutions, shape public attitudes and cultural norms? And if you could just, again, like I said earlier, paint for us real-life scenarios.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, indeed, I'm a human rights lawyer, and I talk a lot about constitutions and human rights. But I think it's important sometimes to go back a little bit and look at some of the founding documents, such as the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that for the first time in 1948 actually set out what the fundamental human rights that we as a global society recognized required protection. And the equal protection of all people, women, children, people with disabilities, and different kinds of vulnerable groups. And I think from there, you find that with this kind of foundation of a UN declaration that is signed by almost all countries around the world, you do have that international commitment. And therefore, you find that constitutions around the world then flowed from that treaty, but also the dozens of treaties that flowed from the UN Declaration of Human Rights that first recognized women's rights, for example. And I think it's important that the constitutions and the constitution making also has to be a kind of public participation process. So in Rwanda, for example, you had public participation. South Africa's constitution is famously made out of the former apartheid regime that then had to find a consensus and a real finding of different kinds of views. So we had to move past apartheid and therefore come to a constitution that recognized human rights and also has a way in which individuals can utilize those human rights in the constitution to realize their own rights. So on the one hand, you have a constitution that sets out what the laws need to look like. No law can be discriminatory because the Constitution says that everyone is equal and everyone is deserving of equal protection. And therefore, every law that is valid in the country must comply with those prescripts. And so also policies that governments come up with must also find their way to the Constitution. So you must have compliance with human rights, with the equal protection of law. And I think what's also very important is that there must be a space for people to participate in the lawmaking. And so I think, when we talk about philanthropy and the different interests, the moneyed interests that philanthropy has, they must be part of this public participation and not just have kind of backroom conversations with government. I think the role of philanthropy is to open spaces to ensure that civil society is also at the table where laws and policies are being discussed. And I find that in some cases, money talks, right? And so philanthropists are invited into rooms and civil society is excluded from those rooms. And I think it's the role of African philanthropy to use that power, not only to influence and lobby, but also to ensure that the views of different groups in society are part of those discussions. And especially in Africa, we have to think about LGBTQ people, people living with HIV, people with disabilities, those people at the margins of society whose views are often not considered, need to be more centered. And that's what a human rights framing is about, to ensure that the most vulnerable are also part of, certainly their views and their interests are also centered in these discussions around law and policy. And to some extent, it's about power and accountability. So I think that in addition to having space for philanthropies, we need to also talk about accountability of philanthropies. In the work that we do as human rights lawyers, part of what we do is to hold power to account. And often that power is held in private hands, whether it's in the corporate sector or in philanthropy. And we have to think about how philanthropy can also be as accountable as other players, such as government and such as civil society. So Swithin was talking about having a regulatory framework around lobbying that would apply to philanthropy. I think that's important, and there are very few countries in Africa. There's actually a survey done by the Good Lobby that shows that there is really a dearth of regulation around this kind of lobbying. So if we're going to utilize power, we have to ensure that that power is utilized in an accountable and open fashion.
Thank you so much. Rijeje, can we appreciate her? She makes some valid points there, accountable philanthropy, and she talks about the need to open spaces for all voices to be heard. And if there's ever a room that can make that happen, it's this room right here. So I hope that, like Claire said earlier, we're not just talking about these things, but we can put them into action. I'd like to move on to Dorothy, our representative for civil society, but also wearing different hats today, an implementer. You're going to be coming from two spaces, hopefully that you can speak from a space of representing where you come from, which is Cameroon, but also what you've seen in Canada, where you're best right now. If you can share with us examples that can best demonstrate the potential of leveraging policy and constitutions in terms of promoting equal rights for women.
Thank you, Isabel. I think you said it really well, and I just want to piggyback on something that Claire said, intentionality. Because I am what I consider a settler in Canada. The land belongs to the First Nations people of Canada, and they've been really kind to let many of us, settle there. So in Canada, we have what they call the Feminist International Development Policy. And I bring that up as an example because I represent civil society, but I also represent the group of what we call international NGOs. So I want to address this on two fronts. So first, in Canada, they have the Feminist International Development Policy. Because it is a policy, it holds all the international organizations accountable that the work they do in education, in health, in water sanitation, economic development, environment, we must make sure that that lens and that we're trying to work to close that gender gap. The second reason I bring it up is because in the Global South, there's lots of civil society organizations that have grown, that are strong. So we, people like me who sit in the Global North, we now need to learn to recognize how we work and partner. So we don't leave Canada to come to Rwanda or go to the Philippines or go to Nicaragua and start to try to talk about gender. People on the continent understand gender. They understand the challenges. They are best placed to understand the gaps. They're best placed to be able to make the decisions and design the programs that will move everybody on this continent forward. So I say that because whilst we have a Feminist International Development Policy, it is so important that back in Canada, the implementation of it is done in such a way where we don't hold on to power. We actually come to the table and be able to make sure that that power is distributed. And the example I want to give, is the Equality Fund. I see my sister Theo is sitting right here, but it is so important that, the government of Canada started a women's fund, the Equality Fund. And what is really specific about that is that because of policy, that fund has been designed to make sure that the voices, the way the granting mechanism is made, it is based on the needs from the people in the Global South. So it's policy that informed action for a project to be designed, and then in that design now we're implementing it, and hopefully in 3 to 5 years, I'll turn and ask Theo, are we doing exactly what we said we were going to do? So for me, that's a great example of policy informing real action that is tangible. On another side, and it is sort of not yet announced, but the organization I work for, the Mennonite Economic Development Associates, we're in partnership with a major foundation on the continent, and we will, in the next few weeks, be announcing a fully funded, women-led fund as well, same like Cici and the group have done. And for that one, we want to be able to make sure that women are brought into the economic development space. So my organization has a policy on gender. The foundation has a policy on gender. And it is those policies that then lead us to be able to take actions and do work that concretely now will be able to help to close that gender gap. So I'm hoping that there'll be lots of times for questions, but I want to stop right there, but to just say that policy is everything. I'm civil society. I'm the greatest critic of civil society. I'm the greatest critic of international, not NGOs, and I sit in one because I believe you have to be in to be able to help make change. You cannot sit on the fringes and try to change this. Yes. So I'm hoping that we can change international NGOs.
Very well said. Very well said. Thank you so much. I'd like now to move on to Claire. My question for you, it really ties into what you said in your opening remarks, but if you can expound and share with us some recommendations for action that can expand legal protections in areas that actually truly matter to women and girls, and also remove those exceptions in laws that just purposefully disadvantage women and girls.
Thank you. I think the first thing that we should do continuously is a diagnosis, and it doesn't happen once, a continuous diagnosis on how we are doing. Rwanda, with all the progress that we've made, six country in closing gender parity, etc. Recently, we worked with the World Bank to do a diagnosis of our legal framework to see areas of improvement, and we did find areas that needed to be improved. And I think that process of a diagnostic assessment, wherever you are, how are we doing? And even bringing independent people to look at you and tell you how you're doing, and be able to address specific things. And some of the things we're looking at, for example, in the new legal framework, we're looking at is increasing the length of paternity leave. We just give a couple of days, and we're debating whether that's not too little for fathers to participate in paternity leaves and look after their children or support their families. We're looking at more protection of women, expectant women at the workplace. So the things that we found that need specific improvement, even with all the progress that we've made. So that, I think, is the first thing, diagnostic assessment of how we are doing wherever we are at organizational level, country level, whatever institutions that we run. But when we talk about policy, I think policy has to be comprehensive. Policy has to look at supporting entry into opportunities. But policy needs to look at supporting women to thrive once they're in those opportunities. And entry, you can put policy 30% women, 30% entry, but once they are in the positions, how do we support women to actually thrive? I think that's really important. A number of points that we need to think about. One is, how do we help develop a pipeline of leaders? One of the best examples I recently had was MTN Rwanda, where MTN has a deliberate effort. They have a club of women, and they go and talk to each other and say, look, where do you want to be in 3 years, 5 years, and how can MTN help you become that? And women begin to dream, and they say, look, today I'm an accountant, tomorrow I want to become head of department. Another one says, today I'm a company lawyer, tomorrow I want to be the company secretary. What does it take for you to get there? And MTN works with you to develop you, take you for training, support you so that you can actually be ready to take that position. So you enter, but also how do we help you to thrive once you're there? The other point also is supporting women and putting policies to support women to thrive at the workplace. Today, we all know that Africa is a young population. They say 70% of the population of Africa is below 30. And they say in almost every country, at least half of the population is women. So if half the population is women, 70% below 30, that means that most of the workforce that we have are going to be childbearing. They're going to be mothers at the workplace. And we've promoted them to get jobs. We're making them contribute very significantly in the workplace. But many of them are going to be young mothers. How do we bring childcare as specific policies to support women to thrive? Today in Rwanda, we're promoting what we call EDCs, childcare programs, where you have children that can come and be supported to start preschool at the workplace. We have, I think, Imbuto Foundation as probably the gold standard that has recently been launched. We have nurseries for women, breastfeeding mothers, giving that environment and what that really means for productivity at the workplace, understanding that that's really important for productivity in the workplace. And I think McKinsey did a study in 2019 that showed that if we took all these best practices, even within the African continent, and implemented them, Africa would add 10% of its GDP, over $3 billion in its GDP, just because of making sure that women and gender parity is really something that is deliberately implemented. So I think that's also really, really important. Maybe the last thing that I want to also finish with is thinking about businesses and women in business is very important as well. In Rwanda, 52% of our SMEs are owned by women. So you cannot talk about economic growth, investments, without talking about how we actually support women, and the 52% of women that are driving SMEs and driving productivity of the economy without specific programs to help them thrive. And I really like some of the programs that some of the banks have, like very specific funds that are supporting women, SMEs, to really thrive. And I think doing that at the bank level or at the organizational level, whether you're a private sector or government or even philanthropy, having very specific programs that helps to close this gender parity, because at the end of the day, productivity is really going to grow once we're very deliberate about this. So again, maybe just to finish with the key point, which is deliberate, intentional, and having very specific actions is a duty for all of us if we're going to make a real big difference.
Wow.
Thank you.
Good stuff. We have to be deliberate, we have to be intentional, and we have to make this a priority. Thank you, Claire. I would like to now take it to you, Swethan. You're going to have to bring it home for us. If you can specifically speak to the people in this room, but not just the philanthropists. I want you to expand this to family, private, and corporate foundations, and talk to us about how they can shape policies that advance opportunities for women and girls. Where do we start?
Thank you, Isabella. As I mentioned earlier, we need to really reshape the paradigm. In the old philanthropy, in my view, and what some of the literature has shown, is, you give money to a cause, particular cause, and you get your name on it. I think the new philanthropy, which can still be combined with some of the old, should look to systemic change. You can put money to help 60, 80 children in a particular district in school. But if you can work to pass legislation so that all the children in the country can attend school, that's more impactful. So I think, and if I was asked, I could pick a number of individuals in this room from different countries, and we could work together and say, look, let's work on this parliament. Rwanda is in a special place because what happens is Rwanda pushes the envelope. When you think of President Kagame doing what he's done in this country, the very difficult things, and Elon Musk going to the moon, taking a rocket to the moon and bringing it back to land on the particular point that it left. I mean, that really requires intention. So I think we need to start thinking how we can come together, because we're already coming together on a whole host of things, but we're not coming together on societal impact things. And that's what APF is trying to do. It crowdsource, maybe that's the wrong word, but we try to bring African philanthropists together to think about how we can promote systemic change. So I think that's really important. It seems a little bit pie in the sky, but actually, African philanthropists, they don't call themselves philanthropists, but there are a number of high net worth individuals that are actually getting things done. But they're getting their own things done. So it might be a group of manufacturers who lobby for tax incentives to a particular industry. That same energy can be used for other positive things, equally positive things. I was very touched by a deep impact initiative, which I think we can learn from in Boston, the Access Strategies Fund, who realized that the voting gap between majority white neighborhoods and communities of color were really quite far apart, and they worked quite closely to close that gap. And today, the gap between majority white neighborhoods and communities of color in Boston have closed. And I've been told that by a close friend, actually, who served as American ambassador to Tanzania, Charles Stith. And he confirmed that to me, he's a New Englander, that indeed this is happening. But it was intentional. It was a group of people coming together to decide that that is something that needed to be done. Melinda and Gates Foundation, which collaborate with CC on the Gender Fund, have created a dashboard that allow government to visualize areas where there are barriers to women in a number of countries, Kenya, India. Now that's a big foundation. But trust me, the people in this room and out of this room, if put together, can influence research initiatives to be shared with government, so government can more clearly visualize where the hot spots are. When I look at our legislators, talking about the need for advocacy and legislative reform, they just need the right information. They love to interact with the private sector. Use that opportunity to influence them positively about things that they wouldn't expect you to do. So it shouldn't just be the big, major foundations which are helping to influence parliamentary reform in particular countries, but it should be us philanthropists. And we don't call ourselves philanthropists because, again, of what I said earlier, we have not been organized. But if we organized, created a strategy, and then developed an engagement with the public sector, with the legislature, I think we could make substantive change.
Absolutely.
So again, Rwanda's an aberration, but we can use that example to inform other initiatives across the region.
I am so sorry to interrupt. I want to give you another 60 seconds to wrap up. I'm being informed we have to get to the closing of the session. Yeah. Please, finish your thoughts.
So I think my sense would be the clarion call. And again, APF would be an excellent example. Join us as members. Join the APF family. And I think that can be a basis upon which we can build on the ideas that I have shared today.
Yes. And on that note, I'd like to invite you to please appreciate our panelists. They've given us a lot of homework. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge with us. And like he said, joining APF is a fine place to start. They're trying to do something remarkable, and there's power in collective efforts. I would like to now request our lovely MCs, rather beg your pardon, ushers. I hope we have somebody moving. Oh, yes, we do. So in case you have a question, I see one over here. We're going to take 3 people. So we'll take 2 from this side and 1 from, I see a hand over there. Yes. Your name, where you're coming from, would like to know who is represented.
Yes, my name is Wongai Nyahunji, and I work for an organization called Teach for All. So first of all, thank you so much to the panel which shared with us some incredible insights. In particular, I've got a question directed towards Claire. You shared a lot around what the government of Rwanda is trying to do to bring gender parity, and I think you had a few inspiring practical example of how you've done that. So my question to you is, you know, there's this concept around what we call a glass cliff, where women are promoted into these positions, but sometimes they come down as steeply and as fast if they've ascended. So of course you've shared that, you know, you're looking at policies and all sorts of things. So when you think about the glass cliff phenomenon, could you maybe share 1 or 2 things that you have learned or experienced in this regard as the government of Rwanda, that, you know what, we tried this, but we failed, or we learned from it, and this is what we did, so that we could also get a balanced view around, this is working, and also we saw that this and that wasn't working, and we're doing something about it. And I think you mentioned about the diagnostics assessment you're doing. So yeah, so my question is, what are some of the things that you have learned that helps avoid the glass cliff for women? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take 1 more question. There's a lovely lady right behind you.
Good morning.
Good
My
morning.
name is Blaine Emmanuel. I'm from the African Leadership University. So the question I have could go to anyone on the panel. So as the discussion was going on, I could, I understand that there's a lot of things being done, especially here in Rwanda, to close the gender parity. But then we're looking at it from a binary perspective when it comes to gender. So I want to ask how different policies can be created to kind of shape or impact the lives of gender non-conforming people or people who don't subscribe to the gender binary on the continent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take 1 more. I think I saw a gentleman. Oh, a lovely lady at the back. Yes, thank you. Where are the men in the room? No questions? Please. Right behind you.
Thank you very much. My name is Rejoice Naraunda Makau. I'm from Higher Life Foundation. In CSO spaces, we use mobilization and we use movement building as a strategy. And I'm just wondering if this is a strategy that philanthropists could try and do in order to movement build towards the cause of policy change in Africa. If it's worked well in Rwanda, and we're now in a space where we find that there's some level of gender parity that's coming through, why can we not emulate the same using the philanthropist space? Because philanthropies have power and they have resources that comes with that power. Can that not be mobilized into a movement that then influences policy change within the governments of Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll start with you, Sweden, if you have a comment on what she just said, and we'll work our way to the last question that goes to Claire.
Whenever I think of issues of society that, you know, of concern to all of us, I think of the community. And I think across the board, whether it's, you know, the first question or this question, I think we need to sort of change the perceptions of our communities, because that's really where it begins. And again, as philanthropists, because the communities comprises of all kinds of individuals. But philanthropists, again, they may not think of themselves, as I said earlier, as philanthropists, but can be influencers. And if they're intentional. But you have to be intentional about it. So the way Rwanda has been intentional about many things. Somebody asked me, they said, am I in Singapore? I said, actually, I've been to Singapore. Singapore is a great place, but this is better than Singapore. So it's because of intention. So communities can be intentional.
Yes.
So, but they need to know, and they need leadership. Leaders in the community can influence community direction. That's what I would say. And it's common sense, but we really don't do it. We're not intentional about it, but we need to become intentional about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll now move on to Rujeje. I think you touched this earlier, the question from the lovely lady, how we can make sure that these laws also put into consideration inclusivity.
Thank you. I think also we have to, in response to Rejoice's question about social mobilization, I think certainly there's evidence from the corporate sector about what corporate social investment programs fund. They do not fund that work. They do not fund systemic change work. They do not fund social justice work. They do not fund groups advocating for change. And in South Africa, for example, there's a report that comes out every year that shows that between 1% and 3% is spent on this kind of work. And the rest of those funds, which is billions of dollars, right, go towards project-based, the kind of a few children in a district or two in the country get support, and then it's a once-off, right? It's like we put our name on it, we did the thing, and we move on to the next project. So I think there's a real need for a shift in philanthropy to take the risk, as Dorothy said, to take the risk with civil society, with the groups that are working on changes in land reform, in education systems for girls especially, in discrimination in the workplace and labor, advocating for changes that are systemic and will have an impact for generations to come. So I think there's a need for people in this room to think about risk and to think about shifting the risk appetite, to be able to come with civil society and not themselves try to advocate and lobby, but to work with those groups that are closer to the ground, that understand their own circumstances, and very often have the solutions. And then it's about bringing different skill sets to ensure the policy environment changes, the legal environment changes, and that implementation happens in a way that's beneficial for those vulnerable groups. And to the point, I think it's very essential to think about gender identity, the LGBT people, people living with HIV, people with disabilities. All of those people are very often at the fringes, and in our conservative African countries are often excluded, criminalized. And so we need to work on those issues, and there are many groups working on those issues in Africa at the moment.
Thank you. I'm going to give Dorothy about 30 seconds in case there's any comment to the two questions, and then we'll move to Claire.
Yeah, so I just want to quickly say, Rejoice, I really believe that the movements are really important, but the policy is really what's going to translate the actions of those movements into something sustainable. So I think movements alone will not do it if the policies that need to be in place to translate that from just energy to real long-term sustainable systems level change. And I just want to quickly touch on the question around the glass ceiling. I know Claire is going to answer it, but I think, no woman should be set up to fail, or no young person should be set up to fail. I'll just give my example. I live in Canada. It is hugely, I wouldn't say majority white, but as a Black woman put into leadership in a country like Canada, it is so important to have mentors, supporters, coaches, you can't do it alone, so I'll just say really, really important to build a pipeline and to strengthen everybody, young, old, different, who is being given opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. Maybe just to pick up on where Dorothy left it. So what has Rwanda done to ensure that women succeed when they're given these opportunities? And we did see that challenge where, somebody has never been a leader, and then they have this opportunity. How do you make them succeed? One of the things that we decided deliberately was to prepare women so that when they have the opportunities, they have more preparation. And one of the ways we did that was to start something we call the National Women Councils right from the grassroots. So from the very smallest unit of decentralization, you have National Women Councils and they, until the national level. That gave a lot of women opportunities to test their leadership and to really prepare. So if you've been at the village level, and then at the district level, and then at the province, by the time you become an MP, you have learned a lot of things and you're better prepared. So that was one thing that we did as Rwanda. But the other thing that we do a lot is we have conversations. I think one of the ways our governance is done in Rwanda is platforms for conversation and for reflection. We do that as part of our accountability, whether it's even ministers accountable to the public about their performance, but also just having conversation on women. So women share their experiences. They say, look, when I first came, this is the challenge I had. I did the following things to make it happen. So women actually have these conversations and learn from each other, learn from each other's failures, but also pick best practices that they can really implement on their own. So these conversation platforms are extremely important for that. Maybe the last thing I want to finish off also is also the tools that support some of the policies that we have to succeed. We removed all the discrimination against women owning title of land. But sometimes you'd find men go to the banks and they mortgage the house, and then the woman wakes up one day and the house that they're living in is mortgaged because the man was trying a risky business somewhere and the woman had no say. Today in our land title, if a couple is married with community of property, automatically the land title has 50% woman, 50% man. So it's not that we together as a couple own 100% of the land, no. 50% is for the woman, 50% is for the man. So you cannot sell that land when I have not given the authorization as a woman. So those tools really support implementing of policies to really happen. As a result today, 26% of all land titles in Rwanda are owned by women. 54% are owned by both men and women. So you can see women have real access to assets that can really give them real access to prosperity. Thank you.
Wow. I think I'm going to ask us to do better than that. Let's appreciate them one more time. Please stay with me for just a minute, but I'd just like to take this opportunity, first of all, to ask you to clap for yourself for being here, yes, because she talked about the need to talk, conversations, and that's where real change begins. You cannot change what you do not know. All right. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. This is the end of our session. I would like to ask our panelists to stay. We've been requested for a photo moment, and then we'll move on. Thank you.